Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now you might tell I've got the Desert War bug at the moment, so I'm going to show you how you can paint your own British troops, or British vehicles rather, for the desert campaign, whether it be early on in the war or all the way through to Tunisia and early Italy. Now this is super easy to do, it's only a handful of paints as well. Now this Churchill here, this is going to replicate one of the Kingforce vehicles. It is a 3D print, and I'll pop the link to the files for that in the description, although this will work on any vehicle. So all of the paints will be down there too. Let's get started. So once you've got your miniature all assembled, first thing to do is to prime it. Now here I've used the Army Painter's Skeleton Bone Spray, and this is perfect. It is an almost exact sandblasted, weather-worn kind of yellow for what we're going to do. If you want a more factory fresh finish, then what you could do would be to hit this with a coat of dark sand from Vallejo. There isn't really an exact copy of that in the Citadel range. You might try Ushap de Bone as being pretty close, but dark sand, if you do want to go for that brand new look, that's going to be the better choice. But I want this to look as though it's been in theatre for a little while, and Skeleton Bone, just perfect. Now it goes without saying, everything I'm going to do to the tank, I am also going to do to the turret. But let's pull this off and put that aside for now. Alright, now what I've got in my little palette here, this is 20 drops of soft tone from the Army Painter. It doesn't need to be precisely 20, I just like using 10s because it's easier to work out this next step. I've got a little dropper bottle full of water, and I'm going to put in 10 drops now. So they've got a 2-to-1 soft tone to water mix. Now let's mix that up good and proper. I do, this time, want to thin down the color just a little bit, and I want to change the flow property of this quite a lot. So, once I've mixed that in good and proper, we're going to just liberally apply this over the entire tank. Make sure that you are working it into any recesses. And yeah, this is not a difficult stage at all. Just go nuts, and yeah, cover your whole tank. Now painting straight over the primer, sometimes you'll get little streaky parts where the shade doesn't seem to quite want to settle. Just leave it for a few seconds and then come back, brush over the top of it again. That'll be fine. Now that's going to look quite different. If you do end up with any tide marks or little spatters or what have you, don't worry too much about those, because by the time we've applied our weathering, our camo pattern, dust, you're not going to see them. You can, if you're concerned and you do want to tidy up something really significant, a little bit of skeleton bone or dark sand if that's what you've used, just buff over those areas with a dry brush and you'll be fine. But speaking of dry brush, what I've got here is pale sand and a little soft makeup brush. This is a smoky shader. What I'd recommend is once you've worked most of this off into a bit of kitchen towel, try along the running gear to get an idea of what you're going to leave behind, and that's going to be perfect. What we'll do is now dry brush all of the edges and protruding details, so along the hatches and what have you, and spend a bit of time getting that third dimension back on our vehicle. Let's just get that in focus. Now it will look quite bright going on, but don't worry too much. Give it a few seconds to settle, and it will normally tone down a little bit. If you're looking for a Citadel alternative to this sort of color, then something like Pallid Witch Flesh is quite bright, but very close. And as always with dry brushing, remember, not having enough on your brush is better than having too much, because you can always go back and add more if you need to, but you don't want to have to start over if you've got too much on your brush. Now it will take a few passes, and you do want to build up that color rather than trying to apply it all in one quick splatter. But there we have the basis of our sand color, done. If you're painting earlier war vehicles and you don't want to add the camo pattern, just get started painting the other details now, because that's what that's going to look like. As well, remember, do be careful around the machine guns. I cannot tell you the number of times I have knocked off MGs when dry brushing, so slow down when you get to those regions. Now when it comes to the camo pattern, what I'm going to use here is German grey. This is quite dark, it's an almost black, but it has a very faint blue tint to it, which is what we're going to want here. Now what I'm going to do is start applying this in a wavy-ish pattern. You'll see I'm not too worried if my brush skips any areas, or I make a little mistake here, because once I've got the first line on, I can start bulking it out and straightening things out as I need to. Now there's a huge amount of information online about Kingforce color schemes, so if you want to follow the Churchills very precisely, or you can just make it up. Either way, what I'm going to do now is start applying this camo pattern. Official guidance, if you are making it up, was that about a third of the vehicle should be covered in the disruptive color. So away we go with that. Now that is going to take a little bit of doing. Honestly, that will be the slow part the first couple of times you're painting these vehicles. But as you get your eye in, it becomes much easier to make that up. I'm going to pop the turret off again. And now we're going to dry brush the black. I've swapped here to a smaller dry brush. Even smaller than what I've got here is probably a good idea. And we're going to brush over this with light sea grey, which has a very faint bluish tint to it once it's dried. So I want next to nothing on my brush. It's even more important than with the pale sand earlier that there should be next to nothing here. And then, very lightly at first, until we get a feel for what we're leaving behind, we'll dry brush the edges of the black areas and get a little bit more depth there as well. Now if you want to, you can actually shade these guys with a black shade, same as we did for the sandy stuff. But I suggest you're probably not going to need to once we've applied this dry brush. Now with some burnt umber, I'm going to paint in the tracks. Now this is the fun and exciting and not at all mind-numbing part, so put a bit of music on and take your time here. Don't worry if you do hit some of the running gear, but try and avoid it if you can. Now don't worry about those being perfect, just get most of it covered over. And if you need to apply a second coat, don't worry. What I've got here is some flat brown, and I'm going to paint this over the exhausts. Now you could use here the same burnt umber we've just used on the tracks, but flat brown's got a slightly warmer, more red finish to it, which is going to work really well with what I've got in mind a little later on. Alright, now we get to have some fun and do our weathering. If you're going to apply any decals, go ahead and do that now, because any weathering that you do, you want it to look natural by chipping and putting dust over those markings too. But I'm not going to apply any. The Kingforce Churchills were pretty blank. Not totally, but I'm not going to bother. What I've got is a little bit of German camo black brown and some packing foam. And all I'm going to do is, after I've dabbed some of it off onto a bit of paper, is just random little patches where I want that chipping effect to have caught the vehicle. Now, these, you don't want to go crazy with it, because it is very easy to quickly go overboard, but focus on areas where you'd expect either damage, stuff bouncing off the tech, impacts and what have you, and crew movement. So think about where the crew are going to be scrambling over the things and scuff those areas up a little bit too. And of course, anything that I'm doing to the hull, I'm also going to do to the turret. Now it is super easy to go overboard with that, but it's also really fun. So make sure you're setting your tank down occasionally. Look at it from a distance so that you're seeing if you're putting enough on to be seen at table distance, or if you're really overdoing it. And if you overdo it, just back away from that area. What I've got now, this is some bright orange from Vallejo, and we're going to do the same thing again. I've got a really scraggly old brush here, and I am going to get most of my paint off, spin this fella around, and we're going to start stippling lightly this bright orange onto our exhausts. Now it's going to look crazy bright going on, but after a minute or so and it's had time to dry, it will settle down and look quite nice. If you're worried at this stage that that looks too orange, you can hit it with a strong tone or Agrax Earthshade or something, but that's going to look fine. We have got a little bit more to do yet, so don't worry too much. We have another dry brush to apply, and what I've got here is oily steel from Vallejo. You can just as easily use lead belcher or something. You'll see I haven't done the underside of the tank because it's not going to matter. But a dark gunmetal sort of color, we're just going to dry brush the tracks. You can be fairly generous with this, Just slow down a little when you come near any areas that you don't want to be bright silver. Now the beautiful thing about the Churchill is from the sides and certainly from table distance, you're not ordinarily going to see much of that, but it's done. Now the last colour I'm going to apply is a little bit of black just to the MGs. And once those are painted in, we're going to apply our dust filter. Now Vallejo actually does this in a single bottle, which is super useful. But what I've done here is add just a couple of drops of dark sand into one of my little wells here on the palette and filled the rest with water. What I want is a super thin, sandy yellow sort of color. What we'll do then is apply this fairly liberally over the tank. What I want to concentrate on is flat panels where this would have time to gather and really settle, and into recesses where it's going to basically start making a real mess. Now this will look awful going on, so hold your nerve, and I would suggest if you're doing this for the first time, really thin this down more than you might think. It is going to dry a lot more subtle than it looks going on. Like this, my goodness, you know, that is, that is so bad looking. But hold the faith. So what I'm going to do is paint this basically into any recesses. Areas at the front here where you're going to have a lot of it catching, just add one wash, and then once this is dried, you can go back and give it a second. But yeah, have some fun now. Any areas where it collects a little more than you might want, you can dab it with your finger and get a more ragged, patchy appearance to that dust. But yeah, have some fun. Grind it in, smudge it around, go crazy with it. Now once that has had time to dry thoroughly, you're going to get a brilliant dust effect. I have come back and given it a little bit more on some of the areas where it would naturally collect. So some of these flat panels and up on the running gear, I thought a little bit more dust is going to be appropriate. But yeah, that's a lot of fun, really easy to do. And don't be afraid to really get in there and smudge it up. It will look all the better for it. So what I'm going to do now is take it outside. I'm going to hit this with a matte varnish. Let's get a look at what it looks like when it's all finished. And so, there at last, our Kingforce Churchill is complete, using methods that are going to work for anything you want to put into the desert. Now, as I mentioned at the start of the video, this will also work for your early war stuff, or if you want to go into later war, just swap that German grey for a green. And I'd say something like US dark green is going to be the best colour. Say if you're off into Tunisia or into Italy, that'll work fine. So, as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers, Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Andrew, Rod, and Jimmy. Your support means the world, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.